Mr. Trump tweeted that it was the Trump administration's antitrust division. That's part of the Department of Justice. So the Trump administration's antitrust division has been and is opposed to the AT&T purchase of Time Warner in a currently ongoing trial. The Justice Department is currently trying to block this $85 billion deal in the courts. We don't have a decision on that trial. It's ongoing. Let's bring in political analyst Peter Mathews. He's a political science professor at Cypress College in Los Angeles. Peter, first of all, this quote that President Trump has denied the merger, the words of Rudy Giuliani. I think our international audience might not immediately understand why that could be so problematic.
Because it was a denial of a denial, and the whole thing about the merger is that the president, probably did oppose it in the campaign. He said it's too big, the companies are too big. But it's a vertical merger, Cyril, and should not have been opposed because each of the companies do not compete with each other directly. And it had been 40 years since the federal government ever stopped a vertical merger. But I think it was much more his own prejudice against CNN. And that's what AT&T had been complaining about. Now, AT&T's money that was given to Cohen, that was an indirect form of trying to have access. It's not as direct as, say, lobbying directly with funds through campaign contributions, et cetera. And so I think overall, Trump's antipathy towards CNN had the most amount of influence on his denial of the merger. And I do believe he had an influence on that denial with the Justice Department.
Okay, again, help us connect the dots, because that's what the suspicions have always been about. That Trump's opposition to the merger had actually to do with presidential politics and with the way CNN covers his administration.
Well, absolutely, because CNN's been a lot more critical and honest about what was going on in the campaign of all the candidates, and I think they had to be critical of Trump because he deserved it. And they saw it as an anti-Trump network. And you saw him when he put out that video with CNN's logo on the head of a wrestler whose head was taken off. And he was punching the CNN logo. How much more explicit can you get than that? And he's always calling CNN fake news, which is really ridiculous. I mean, he doesn't like news that is critical of him. That's what he calls fake news, no matter who's calling it that. Yeah. So I think that shows the president's true colors. I think that the public should know that by now.
And it's worth reminding ourselves that AT&T, in its original filings to the court, or maybe it was before the filings, I'm not sure, had actually itself made this argument that they thought the Department of Justice was attempting to block the merger for political reasons. But we don't have any proof of that.
That's right, and a particular judge, I think, denied the revelation of what kind of papers could have been used for proof of that. And I think that should have been made public. There's a lot of politics, bad politics involved here, and we should allow things to be normal, and to regularized. So vertical mergers have been approved for 40 years now, and in this case, why all of a sudden the Justice Department kowtows to the president's wishes? That's not democracy or rule of law. That's not the problem here. And I think that's very important to note.
Yeah, and it should be said that the person who handles this at the Department of Justice actually said there was no political influence. I was not influenced. Right. I just reviewed the case on its merits. But also, to your point, there was this previous merger that is often seen as comparable to this one. When Comcast bought up NBC Universal a couple years ago, that went through, no problems.
That's
anyway,
right.
This is still in the courts. About Rudy Giuliani, though. He's been on the job, what, 10 days now? And he's going to have to address these comments. He's going to have to answer questions about this, no doubt.
Absolutely, because when he makes claims like that, people are going to wonder, well, where do you get the proof of that? And if you know something that no one else knows, you better speak up, Rudy. And if he just made it for a political reason, to make it look like there was no influence peddling, Cyril, this is all about dollar democracy, the title of my book, as you know. And there's been so much of money going into the Trump, not just this part of it, but the Trump inaugural committee from private sources, private businesses with ties all around the world to international businesses. $107 million was raised by Thomas Barack, who himself has lots of money coming from overseas, and he donated a lot of money to President Trump's inaugural committee. That's peddling influence. Money in politics, dollar democracy with liberty and justice for some, and Trump is he's not any exception. He's being influenced all the time as well. He gave up a lot of his populist promises to the voters, tax cuts for the super rich. Yeah. He didn't do things like health care for all, and all that's influenced by the big money coming in to elections and inaugural committees and this type of money.
And Peter, I'm actually very glad that you mentioned the title of your book, because it is totally pertinent and relevant to these questions in this interview, and it also happens to be a very good book and happens to be a topic in the news this week, with hundreds of thousands, well over $1 million paid to the president's personal lawyer by different major corporations to try and curry favor with the administration. Peter Mathews, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyril.